Welcome back to the Right Wave Audio community. My name is John, and for this video, we're going to go over Yamaha's 2021 line of Aventage AV receivers. Now, it's been a while since we sat down at the desk here to do one of these deep dives, but it's certainly fun to get back into it, and we're starting to see some momentum with some companies finally releasing some new models. This one came out a few months ago, at least the announcement. Shipping has been delayed somewhat because of issues, but I understand these are in production. Audioholics did a press event a few days ago, I think about 4 days ago, with Phil Shea. It was an excellent video. I'm going to put a link in here. I recommend that you look at it. They're going to cover they cover some details that I'm not going to get into, but it's very well done. They run about an hour and a half. I don't think I'm going to run that long. But with this video, we're going to go over the new RX-A8A, the RX-A6A, the RX-A4A, and the RX-A2A, and compare them against their counterparts from 2 and 3 years ago. So let's take a first look at these models. Cosmetically, these are different. So what Yamaha's explained is this is a brand new platform. They hope to carry this for the next 10 years as they normally do. They usually have 10-year runs with a design language and platform of electronics. Now they may add and remove models from that platform, but it's the still general basis for the code and the electronics that are within them. So this is setting the stage up for the next 10 years to take us through the decade. And looking at, the flagships for these receiver lines from, well, the one from 2018, the RX-A3080 and the new RX-A8A, they look different. Now we're down to, one large knob in the center versus that symmetrical look that was in the prior generation. Gone is the hidden door. Now, if you know me from other videos, I've never been a big fan of the hidden door. If it's important enough to put on the front panel, just make it accessible. Don't make me open a door. And they typically don't look as good open as they do closed. Just expose those items. We can see right away they've done a great job of adding a 1/4-inch headphone jack right on the front where we need it. What is interesting here is the display seems smaller. Now Yamaha goes on and explains here, apparently when you're using the remote, you're changing a function, the font gets bigger. There's what they call a higher resolution screen that they can adjust the font sizes. So when you're making adjustments from your seated position, it actually gets larger. But boy, this is not as large of a display as what we're seeing from other companies like Anthem and NAD that are doing larger displays. Of course, the one that I like is the Arcuous Muse and the way they do their front displays. So still a fairly small display. In fact, looks like it's going to be smaller than the prior generation, but I could be mistaken from the photos. Looking at the rear of these units, just a quick inspection here. It looks like they preserve just from visually a lot of the same items, but there's been some rearrangement here of them. We're going to get into the deeper dive on the actual I/O count that is included, but at the same price points, I think in general they're keeping a similar I/O count. Maybe not quite the same. Well, we'll explain when we get into it. And this line of receivers, is builds on it. They start with the 2A and go up to the A2A to the A8A, and we're even looking in our comparison with the CX-A5200, which is a processor only with no amplification, and see how that fits into the whole series. So let's take a look at this. You know, let's take a look at this in a quick summary here across the whole line. And the ones here that are marked new, of course, are the new models. The ones that don't say new are the ones from 2 or maybe even 3 years ago, depending on the model. Uh, it's interesting in the age where a lot of manufacturers are going up to 16 channels and beyond. Yamaha seems to stay at a more modest count. I think their philosophy is they're going to do 13.2 really well versus adding more channels to the processor. Of course, as a receiver, you also have to have those amplifiers to go with it. So it probably makes sense that they don't cram too much in a receiver unit, but their processor only is still, their flagship is still the CX-A5200, which is also 13.2 limit. So they're not known to go beyond that at the moment. Time will tell. Now, just while we're on the processor only model, what Yamaha has told us is we won't be seeing an upgrade to that soon. Now it will be replaced, but maybe not in the next year. They're really focusing on getting this new receiver line out in a good way this year, and we'll see what is to become of the processor only line going forward. But we hope they continue that in a strong way. As I said, this starts off with the RX-A8A. This is an $899 unit. It's 100 watts per channel. It's driving 7 channels for an 8 channel of processing, so 7.1. And if you remember some of our convention, we brought this forward in this review where we do the layout here that shows, you know, with 8 channels of processing, you've got a 5.1.2 system if you want to do Atmos, or some more simplified 7.1. And we see that the A2A, the prior generation A880, the A1080, and the new A4A all are this same speaker configuration of 5.1.2, 5 base layer, 1 subwoofer, and 2 height channels. Now you might be saying, well, I've seen the Yamaha website and they advertise it as 2 subwoofers. Well, that's not the way we represent it. If those physical connections on the back of the processor or receiver are in parallel and not discrete, we only count those as 1 on Right Wave Audio Community. And so we're not going to give them credit for that .2 unless they're discrete. You can always utilize it for 2, but that's how we represent it. Now you'll see a lot of consistency across the board here, and as you move up to the higher range here, the A4A, which is the top of the line with that speaker configuration, that's at $1,400. I think it's actually $1,399.99, but close enough, right? That takes you up another 10 watts per channel, and you get a few other, but it's very consistent up to that point. And then we move to the 10, 11, 12, and 13 channels processing models. So the 10 and 11 were from the prior generation, the A2080 and the A3080. And so those were 10 and 11 respectively, 140 and 150 watts, 9 channels driven on those, well, not two channel driven for that rating at 8 ohms, but 9 channels of amplification total. And here you can see with a 9.1 or a 9.2, because the 3880 had discrete subwoofer, dual subwoofer outputs, you could do 5.1.4 or 7.1.2 for the 2080, or 5.2.4 and 7.2.2 for the 3080 processor. So The 3080 was certainly the better deal because you had the dual subwoofer, but you had to pay a little more for that, roughly $400 more for the 3080. Now they have the 6A, and this is a 12-channel of processing unit, but you're still at a 5.2.4 or 7.2.2 on the speaker configuration, so that they do have some extra processing if you want to send it out to an external amplifier. So this brings you up to 9.2 configuration. And then finally, the largest configurations, their 13.2 configurations, are with their processor only, the A5200, and the new receiver A8A. And that's giving you 11 channels of amplification, 150 watts at 8 ohms, 2-channel driven on that rating. What you'll notice across all these, they're not doing XLR pre-outputs on these. If you do have pre-outs, they're all RCA. The only exception is the processor only model. So if you want XLR outputs to go out to amplifier, don't look at the receivers from Yamaha, look at the processor. The next, we bring our eye down to the processing, the surround sound formats that it's delivering, the immersive formats. And this is where it's at today with these models. It supports Dolby Atmos across the board. Every model has Dolby Atmos, and also every model has DTSX on board today with the current firmware. Now, what Yamaha is saying is the old models will support, the other formats. It won't support DTSX Pro, and it won't support Aural 3D. But there's things that could be coming with the new models. With the 6A and the 8A, they have planned support for Aural 3D. And in fact, they're saying that they're running this in beta in their facilities already. So that might not be too far in the distant future for Aural 3D. They also say the chipsets are DTSX Pro capable. Now, what I don't understand is that when they say it's capable, are they talking about the platform being capable in future models within this 10-year platform going to say support DTSX Pro, or is it these models that will be upgradable to DTSX Pro? So we're waiting for more information on that detail. But all the other models, don't have DTSX Pro or Aural 3D. So you've got the two core formats and everything else. Looking at the other really consistent features, they all have a 1/4-inch headphone jack. Thank you, Yamaha. I much prefer have a 1/4-inch jack versus an 8-inch jack. They all, have an Ethernet or wired Ethernet port. They all have Wi-Fi. They all have Bluetooth in and out. So Bluetooth out to, let's say, the MusicCast speakers or headphones, and Bluetooth in if you're using your mobile phone to stream music into the system. So they've really got the Bluetooth and the wireless all covered. They all have an AM/FM tuner. They all have a built-in moving magnet phono preamp. And the other thing, I can't see my glasses. Oh yes, they all have a removable IEC power cord, but they don't have any place to plug in the accessory power, which is kind of a thing of the past. And all have a USB connection on that. So really neat from this first inspection here on the details. And so the prices, run up. You can see as the models go up here, the prices run up to $3,000 for the new A8A. That's slightly more than the A5200 processor, but keep in mind that's with 11 channels of onboard amplification at 150 watts. So that's pretty good. The other thing that we'll see here is they all support WiPo calibration. That's their own proprietary room calibration solution. Here is where there's some differences. The lower end models only support what they call multi-point. The new A2A does add in the RSC. I'm not quite sure what that all means, but we'll have to do a deeper dive on the room calibration. But just pointing for those who know what all these are, that it is adding in some extra room calibration features. So when you've moved up to the 1080 or the new A4A, that brought in the precision EQ, or high precision EQ as they call it now, which is using 64-bit processing. It's also in the new models adding in a 3D capability, and so that's carried forward there. And then when you get into the 6A, you also have this low frequency mode, and that's carried up as well. I did notice one thing on the A5200 I didn't see on the other models, was this angle measurement. Maybe that's in some of the others. You know, they're not always, manufacturers aren't always consistent on their website and in the literature. But you can see that the YPOW goes up. The other thing you'll notice is none of these receivers are THX certified. Now, that's not a big issue because no manufacturers really that we have seen producing THX certified, new THX certified processors or receivers. Now, we have seen the new speakers that have come out with this Optimus or whatever the new grade of a speaker is on that, but not on the processors. And also, none of these processors, receivers here, are currently IMEX enhanced. Now, whether they make that marketing decision to do that or not, we'll see. Now, looking at, I'll need my glasses, I think, for this one. The inputs and the outputs. What I like about Yamaha is every model has a lot of HDMI inputs. In fact, there are 7 on every single model here. What differs is the number of outputs. On the lower end models, you get 1 or 2 outputs. So the A2A is only a single output. The old 8880 that's now discontinued had 2, but all the other models are 3-channel outputs. The other thing is, if you've done your upgrades on the older models, they all support eARC on at least one output, or on one output. And so that's really good news. We've got the eARC on all of these. All the other digital I/O, as far as SPDIF, the coax, and the optical, there's at least one of each for inputs on all these models. As you go up the models, they give you more. I do feel it's been a bit stingy on the lower end. I would have, even on the lower models, I would like to see more than one coax and one optical input. What they don't do in any of these models is output the coax or the optical, but you have the HDMI, and perhaps today that is just sufficient to have the HDMI digital output. So let's just consider the coax, and the SPDIF is more of a legacy digital input. And so you've got that. You've got one on the A2A, on the A4A, you've got another optical, so I'm bringing it to 2. And then when you get into the 6A, it's 2 coax and 3 optical, and that's how they continue on. Now, older models, they got up to 3 coax, and of course I prefer to have the coax, so I wish they had kept that level. But in any case, none of these support the AES EBU inputs you see on the more expensive $5,000 plus models, so we weren't expecting it here. As far as preamp inputs and outputs, we don't see the XLR balanced until you get up into the higher end models. So the A3080 gives you one pair for the front channels, and that's carried forward on this A6A and the A8A. So if you have a high-end source component that giving balanced outputs with a really good DAC in it, you can bring that stereo signal into it through the XLR, and that's good news. Of course, on the A5200 processor, you've got a full 11.2 set of inputs there that are XLR. Most of the I/O is going to be RCA connections. So what you see is the pre-outputs, they still give them to you. So if you do in the future want to use external amplification, you've got the full 7.1, 7.2, 10.2 to 11.2 respective for the unit. Now, the one exception is the entry-level A2A is only going to give you a 2.1 pre-output. So that's a little limiting if you want to do some outward expansion, but you could at least power your front speakers using those pre-outs. As far as analog inputs, you've got a minimum of 3 inputs. All of them give you at least one output, one extra zone of output. And then when you get into the higher end models, starting with the 2080 and going up, which is inclusive of the A6A and the A8A, you get 2 zones. What you'll also see, though, starting with the 3080, is as we said, that balanced input, but also a balanced output for your signals there. Video, legacy analog video is still remaining on these units, although you don't see it on the A2A and or the A4A. So on the new models, you've got to go into the A6A, and they give you 2 of the composite and 1 of the component. I always get those mixed up. I probably just did. And the same with the A8A. I don't really care much about those at this day and age, but if you do have some legacy equipment, they could come in handy. With the phono input, now they all have them, as we said earlier, and it's a moving magnet, not moving coil, as normal for these receiver processors. What they're starting to do, though, with the A4A, A6A, and the A8A, is sharing one of the inputs. So you have to make a decision. You want to use that analog input for a standard line source or for the phono. And so that's an interesting design decision there that they did some cost reduction. And then there's some triggers. So they have the remote triggers. And so you've got the in and out on the remotes. Plus you have at least one output trigger if you want to turn on your amplifiers or whatever. When you move up to the A4A, you've got 2 output triggers, and then they're on up to the highest end models. So that's your I/O configuration, and that's all pretty good there. I did miss earlier, as far as the amplification on these, I understand that they've done a pretty good job at having a high quality output. Good ratings here, that they'll work with 4 ohm speakers, so that could be comforting for you, particularly if you're only using your 4 ohm in your front, and for most applications, what they're doing is very sufficient, particularly when the higher end models. Let's take a look at the DACs now, and there are some variations here. On the entry-level models, so the A2A and the 880, they're using Texas Instruments Burr Brown chipsets, and they'll use 4 of them to make up because these are 2 channels per chip, so that gives you the 8 channels necessary for the processing. But regardless of what chip they're using, these are all 32-bit chips for every model. I don't have all the data for signal to noise and THD, But it's obvious as you get into the higher end models, you get a little more dynamic range through these. But what they're very consistent about is that the PCM is, for all of them, is up to 384 kilohertz. And they do have DSD support, and that's handled through the HDMI. And that will get you up to 250 DSD 256. And so I think that's 11.1 megahertz, if I recall right. So I think some of the models, if I dug deeper, I would find some of the signal to noise, but they're not readily available for every model. The actual processor output. And remember, there's a difference between what the DAC chip outputs and what the processor receiver outputs at the end of the line is usually lower. So keep that in mind when you see these specifications. But it's interesting that the 2080 had a pretty high rating compared to even some of the newer models. That was up to 135 dB. Although that would be for the way they were doing that, could not and have the end result as we were saying. So they're all once you get above the 1080, they're all ESS chips, which are well respected. And so the higher end models are using dual ES9026 Pro chips. Now, not the highest grade chip we see out there, but very well respected. And in some cases, like the mid-level, they do a mix. Like the A6A has the ES9026 Pro, I believe, for the ear level bed, and then they use the 9007S for the height channels. So they do some cost reduction there. Looking now into the networking, as we said before, across the board, Ethernet, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, Bluetooth in, Bluetooth out, across the board. So not much more to look at deeper here. Just a good general story. All right, HDMI. So whether the excitement has been with this new Yamaha range is the support for the new 2.1 HDMI standard and 8K video. And it's been exciting because the other entries into the market, and of course Denon Marantz started this, Sound United, with some of the first models out there, but they were only doing it for one channel. What Yamaha is doing is they're put the same chipset circuitry in for every channel. So this is the all 7 inputs and 3 outputs on the larger model. So every input and output is at this newer standard, which is wonderful. It's got the chipsets to do that. What I understand, though, is to make this fully enabled, they're still waiting on some firmware upgrades that have to happen. And part of the challenges here is having the right test equipment to make sure that when they put the code in there for HDMI 2.1, it's operating correctly. So I think that's part of the delay. So instead of having this all green for the new models, I have it blue with an asterisk because it's waiting on firmware to upgrade that. But if you have one of the older models, those aren't field upgradables to 2.1. So if that's important to you and you have one of the older models, you will have to move to one of the new receivers, but you might want to wait until that firmware is available. As said before, you got eARC with every single model, CEC control, of course. The baseline is the 4K 60. And again, we have an asterisk. And so this isn't full green as well, although I could have put, well, it's going up to 120 hertz at 4K, waiting on the firmware. So all the new models will go up to 4K 120. We also have an asterisk on the 8K. So as much as they're advertising their 8K capability, this is waiting on a firmware upgrade, and that will do up to 8K 60 hertz, on these new models. Currently, no 8K at all until that upgrade comes. As far as your dynamic range, you've got HDR10 on every model. The new models will support HDR10 Plus with the firmware upgrade that's pending. Every model supports Dolby Vision. None of them support IMAX to enhance. Everyone also has hybrid log gamma support and the Rec 2020. So I think they're doing really well in the video section, but just get that, hopefully they get that firmware out there so people can start enjoying the full benefits of 8K. And we love it that they've done it across every channel. I suspect that the likes of Den and Marantz are ultimately going to get there, but right now they're at one channel. Now looking at control, so voice control. Some people really like using voice control. I'm not one of them. I don't like talking to my equipment. I do use it occasionally to search for a movie. But aside from that, these support Alexa and Google and Siri, but we've got kind of a light green color here because it's done through AirPlay 2. It's not really a direct. No support for direct Josh. As far as control through an automation system, it can be done through Ethernet. It can be done through the remote input and output. There is a DB9 connector on the back of all of these, and there is our trigger outputs. And actually, some of these should say 2. And let's see. As far as support, they're not, claiming any particular integration with Control4, Savant, RTI, Creston. They generally just say in their edit that it's a third-party control driver capable. Now, if you go on to Control4, whatever, I see that they've got drivers for Yamaha products. So if that's interest of you, you should check to see if they have the support for the newer models. But Yamaha's not really putting any endorsement behind any of these integrations. Looking at streaming ecosystems, the Aventage line across the board supports AirPlay 2 and Google Chromecast. I don't see any support for Sonos. If you need Roon support, I did read on some forum that people are able to get it to work via the AirPlay 2. But again, it's not great because it's not directly supported. So I just about say that it doesn't have Roon, but you could get it to work. It has Spotify Connect support. There's no DTS Play-Fi. And of course, there is the Yamaha MusicCast system. So those are all the streaming ecosystems that are supported. As far as internet streaming, there's a good amount of support here. And for the most part, the updates with the older generation have kept this up to date. So with the updates, you can get Amazon Prime HD music support. On the new models, it's just there. Apple Music is available via AirPlay 2. So it's not a full green. It's not a natively supported format. But then you have native, Deezer, Napster, Pandora, Spotify, Sirius XM, Tidal. I don't see anything in there about MQA support or YouTube Music, but Qobuz as well. And so it's a good list. It's not as much as some others, but not bad. And this is also of the MusicCast system. We also looked at the remotes. And, if you look at the page here, these all pretty much look the same. Although if you read the fine print, they all seem to have different model numbers. There's some subtle, differences in the buttons or the control commands that are sent out. So I don't see that these are backlit. And so, it's aesthetically pleasing looking remote. I don't know how ergonomic it is without holding it myself. But just keep in mind that you're generally getting the same remote with each of these Aventage receivers. Now, some physical characteristics. The size of these are very similar. They get a little bigger, particularly in the height when you get into the more expensive models. And of course, the weight goes up. You range from 22.5 pounds, 10.2 kilograms with the entry level, and that's all the way up to the massive 11-channel RX-A8A, which is 47.2 pounds, 21.4 kilograms. This is typical. What we see is Yamaha puts a lot of heft into their designs, and they are into rigid chassis and robust transformers. Look at the power consumption goes all the way up to 600 watts here. And so, these are pretty well built. And if you do take the time to look at the video that Audioholics put together on this, Phil Shea does go over a lot of details about what they've done to get rid of vibration and put that fifth foot on the bottom to be right under the transformer, and all this extra rigidity that they put in the chassis, the H bracing, the extra metal plates. And it is definitely a well-conceived, physically conceived piece. And as you can see some of these slides here, and even just some comparison, there is some consistency in the A5200 and the A3080 look similar to this, but you can see that they have updated it slightly. There are some, looks like some of the heat sinks look similar from the prior generations. The power supply looks similar, but they've made some, I can see in here, some other improvements as they have gone here. But physically, I do think that the look is modernized. I did think that Yamaha had kind of a classic look going. Of course, that design language was from 10 years ago. So this is going to take them through the next decade, and I think it looks very similar to other modernized equipment that's coming out there. Last thing we'll look at is the interfaces for these receivers, and look at it from the essentially every model within a generation has the same interfaces as the one before. In fact, you'll see that even across generations, we're seeing some consistency. Really the big difference is in that front panel display. And you can see that here is, it's interesting. They say that this, when you change those settings, the text gets bigger and everything. But I don't know. I have to see this for myself. I'm wondering if it's as clear on the new models as it was on the old. Certainly the screenshots I have access to don't make that too conclusive that they've made an upgrade there. With display technologies improving so much, I wish they had done a little bit more onto that regard. And when it comes to configuration, it seems like they just reuse the menu pages from the existing models. So no big surprises there, including the YPOW configurations. And in fact, I don't think they've upgraded YPOW at this moment. Although with the new processing capabilities, one thing you'll see in the Audioholics video is they've got some system on a chip capabilities. And I bet, that's going to allow them to do some more upgrades in things like YPOW going forward. But as of right now, this initial release, I think you're seeing the exact same YPOW as you had before. For playback, again, the interfaces are the same. Either that's that on-screen display that you can navigate your music, or it's using the music cast on your phone, the Android or Apple phones. So really no changes there. So, That kind of wraps it up there. What do you think of the new Yamaha line? Do you Is this line excite you? Were you looking for something more? You know, uh, I think once they've got that firmware upgrade that's promised, you're going to get that 2.1 HDMI. You're going to have a lot more features there. Uh, but are you also, longing for DTSX Pro? Are you longing for more channels? I think want a few more channels on this. Uh, is the two discrete subwoofers sufficient? Do you need three or four? That feedback would be useful to the RipeWave audio community. And if you liked and enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to this RipeWave audio community. And be sure to hit that bell icon so you'll be notified the next time a video is posted. Until then, keep evolving your audio experience.